Okay, let's continue from the previous lecture. So we created a very simple button like this, and we saved it as buttons.html. So you can open up that file. And now let's start creating button groups. Okay, so let me just copy this entire thing here and paste it to create two buttons. And I'm going to change the column to 6 to leave some room for the buttons. All right, or let me just change that to 12, makes it easier. Okay, so now I've created two buttons, each with the context class of primary and the size of large button LG. I've added the role of buttons to both of the buttons, and I've added some icons here. Okay, let me just change the text. Okay, and I'm going to change the icon. Okay, so what you have now are two buttons, and it's very obvious that these are two separate buttons because of the space in between those buttons. So what we're going to do is, let me change the color of the context of it to button default. Okay, and now what we're going to do is make this into a button group and get rid of the space in between, and also make those buttons join seamlessly. So to do that, we have to add the div class of button group. Okay, button group, and let's close that div right after the second button. Okay, so now we have a button group, and you can see now this is way slicker than having two individual buttons that look like they are just next to each other but not necessarily within the same action or the same toolbar or whatever. Now we have a button group, and let's look at adding more buttons to the button groups here. So I'm going to add a third button. I'm going to call this delete. I'm going to add the context of danger to it. Danger. And okay, right, nice. Sign up, back home, and delete. So with button groups, you can actually add as many buttons as you want, and all lines up nicely like this. Now let's look at what other classes that you can use for your button group. And since I have created the course materials and I have put in all the Bootstrap CSS, that will be very easy for you to do. Just type button dash group, and now you can see a few other things as well. Okay, button group justified, button group LG, button group small, button group vertical, button group extra small, and you can ignore the rest of it. So what happens when you click on button group justified? It will span end to end of the entire column if you place it in directly in a column, or whatever element that you happen to place it in. So if I change this to 6 columns, so now you can see it's end to end of the column, and all the text of the buttons or the size of the buttons will automatically adjust itself to flow from end to end. And also because of we put in the class of justified, will automatically adjust itself to be justified. Now let's look at some other classes that we can apply here. Button group vertical, and this stacks the buttons up in a vertical format. Okay, now let's look at the button group sizes. Button group LG, button group SM. Alright, so you can assign a class to individual buttons to indicate the size that you want. In this case, for all 3 buttons, I have put a class of button dash LG, but in the button group I've put the class of button group small. So this actually is the primary way of styling the size of the buttons in a button group, and whatever you put here is ignored. Okay, so I can change this easily to LG or SM. All right, but I can't change it to button group default. That's the only thing here. So if I want to change it to default, then I have to remove the classes for the size. Alright, so now we talked about button groups, justified button groups, and also vertically stacked button groups. Now let me make all the buttons bigger because I'm sure you're straining to see what I'm doing. Alright, now how about going further, going more than this? What can you do if you want to put 2 button groups? Alright, so let me collapse this. I'm going to copy this button group and I'm going to put another button group. Alright, and I'm going to change the column size to 12. Okay, and in this one I am just going to use 2 buttons, right? And I'm going to collapse this button group again, and I'm going to add another button group. Okay, so you're watching this and you're thinking like, I don't need so many buttons. Yeah, you most probably don't need so many buttons. Okay, but if you are designing a specific type of toolbar, for example, maybe player controls for a video or some other element on your site, you may want to have a lot of buttons. And especially when you talk about just using icons for those buttons, not really using tags, so that makes more sense. So just using icons, and I have buttons over here. So now one easy way to control this 3 different button groups is to enclose it in a larger or in a div for button toolbar. Oops, sorry. Div class button toolbar. Alright, so now you have your button toolbar. And you're thinking, yeah, that looks exactly the same as, you know, it would without a button toolbar, and that would be right. But by putting it in a button toolbar, you can actually do a few things over here. Number one, you can align some of the buttons to the left or to the right. Okay, so you know what, there are too many buttons here. I'm going to delete one button group. Alright, let's just do 2 button groups. Now for this button group, I want to align it to the right, and in Bootstrap you can align anything to the right by adding the class pull right. Alright, and now you see that this button group has been pulled to the right and this one is still on the left. According to the Bootstrap documentation, the proper way to style this is also to add role toolbar to the button toolbar, and for the button groups you have to add role equals to group. Okay, you don't have to do this. I always forget to do the small stuff like this when I'm just designing the user interface, but eventually this gets added in by our developers. Okay, so if you're just trying to do a rough sketch of a rough mock-up of the site that you want to build, you don't have to go to all the lengths to make sure it's proper. Okay, you can leave it out. It doesn't really matter much. All right, so now before I end the section on buttons, I forgot to talk about 2 additional things you can do with a button. Okay, which is you can assign the role of active to it. Now let me change all the buttons to the same context, so it will be easier for you to see the difference. Okay, to make a button active, you may want to add active to the button, and this tells the user that this is the option that they have selected at the moment. Okay, now while a button is active, the user can still interact with the button. Okay, you can still click on the button. So if you don't want that to happen, then active is not the right class to use. Okay, and what you need to do is make the button disabled. And to do that, type in disabled. Oops, this. Alright. And now the button is completely unclickable. It's redundant. There's nothing you can do with the button. Well, actually the right way to do it is disabled equals to disabled. Alright, that's the same thing, but this is the right way to do it. Now let me give you a real life example of how you would want to use button groups. Right, so here is the application user interface that I developed for one of our software, which is Link Tracker. So I use a lot of button groups in this. Button toolbars and button groups as well. So what you see here is a button toolbar, which consists of 3 different button groups, 1, 2, and 3. So the reason really for using button toolbars is to create some kind of easy navigation that you can easily align. So you can align some of it to the left and some of it to the right, and you can create a button group for related functions. Alright, so in this case this is to click on reports, and that is a separate function, and all this stuff is to create something new. Okay, and here is for the settings. And another example would be when you want to create just 2 buttons, alright, but you want those buttons to be aligned to the left or to the right. Using button toolbar is one way to do it. You can also just create 2 different buttons and assign the class of pull left to one of it and pull right to one of it. Alright, so I hope you enjoyed this tutorial on how to create button groups and button toolbars in Bootstrap.